Hey, what's going on, everyone? It's Andres here from On the Break OTB, brand new segment from Cartilage Free Captain. Guarantee if you're a Spurs fan and you like this, just hearing about what's going on out in the Spurs world, you're gonna like what we're doing. So I am making these individual videos to supplement those. So think of this as more of a tactics session, if you will, on what Tottenham have been up to on the pitch. Over the last week and a half, not much, right? The international break. But just before the international break, there were some patterns that I spotted throughout the Arsenal game, throughout the Dinamo Zagreb game, and then finally against Aston Villa. And I wanted to point these out to you guys because I haven't seen anyone else talk about this. And it was essentially Tottenham's build-up and how they played very poorly against Arsenal, did a little bit better against Dinamo Zagreb, and did excellently against Aston Villa and building from the back. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So against Arsenal, a pretty turgid game overall, but our build-up specifically was problematic. And this was due to Arsenal's high press. Arsenal typically like to play in a 4-2-3-1, but in attack, it can turn into an almost five up front type of system, somewhat similar to Spurs actually. Whenever Spurs are in an attacking mood, which frankly hasn't been too often this season. But back to Arsenal. They were pressing Spurs extremely high up the pitch and essentially limiting Tottenham's build up from the back options, simply because they knew that if they forced the players from the back to go either wide or long, they would essentially nullify any attack that Spurs might have by always beating them either to the second ball or always beating them on the header. So here's a good example of how Arsenal are pressing from literally minute one and making sure that no one in Tottenham's back line is feeling comfortable. They were very confident in this ability to limit Tottenham's buildup from the back because, as you can see here, Granit Xhaka, who does not have blistering pace, is pushing up as well to cover Højbjerg as an option. Odegaard is covering Toby Alderweireld, and Lacazette is covering Sanchez. And of course, their wingers are covering Tottenham's fullback. So this forced Lloris to go long multiple times. And when I say multiple times, I mean multiple times. This was Lloris's game in the Premier League with the most amount of long passes attempted, 14, and the least amount of success, less than half of those passes being a successful pass. So right from the get-go, Arsenal is stifling Tottenham in the back, and that affects, of course, the production in the front, right? If Tottenham aren't able to maintain possession and aren't able to build from literally their own net, then they can't produce attacks moving forward, right? And that is the main reason that Arsenal were so successful at keeping Tottenham shots and attacking opportunities to an extreme minimum. So Sanchez, for his part, was pressed very, very well by Arsenal too. It wasn't just Lloris. If you look at his numbers from the entire season, he typically averages around 4.2 long passes a match. Against Arsenal, he made 8, and only 25% of them, 2, were successful. So that just goes to show how good Arsenal were at squeezing Tottenham's back line. And then finally, probably the most telling fact, or the most telling stat here, is that against Arsenal, we had 60 progressive passes attempted and 38 were successful. That's the lowest of attempted and success rate for Spurs this entire season in the Premier League. So that just goes to show we were completely outplayed as far as pressing goes. And it's disappointing, or it was disappointing, because I wrote an article previewing the Arsenal match, and I mentioned that the best way to beat Arsenal right now is to press them, into making a mistake, because God knows they've given up so many goals off of pressure mistakes. The few times that Spurs were able to play through the first line of pressing, it seemed like the midfield just didn't really know what to do. In this screenshot, we see Tanguy Ndombele with the ball, and Højbjerg and Lucas Moura are effectively pointing at each other And Tanguy doesn't really know who to pass to because they're both being covered. That he has no real passing options because Bakary Saka is covering the left flank. All he can really do is either go long or go backward. So, just one example of how Arsenal were outnumbering Tottenham's midfield and again, neutering attacks before they even started. And of course, in classic Spurs fashion, we didn't help ourselves. So here we see Davison Sanchez passing the ball laterally towards Toby. When Tanguy Ndombele sees this, he needs to run into the open space because he can tell, everyone can tell, what direction the pass is going, where it's going to go, right? Ndombele needs to make himself a passing option before the pass is even completed because he should and absolutely does have the awareness to understand how the play will progress. So this is, I think, one example of just how Tottenham were just off the pace for the entire match, right? This is the type of movement that you can expect of both Tanguy and Højbjerg when they're playing well. But unfortunately, they just seemed a bit sleepy in the build-up phase for Tottenham. After catching these things against Arsenal, I really had this filter on in my, I guess, in my eyeballs. Just looking for more examples of this kind of stuff in future matches. And you can bet that it was a very, very similar story against Dinamo Zagreb. Granted, I do think that we played better than against Arsenal. At the same time, obviously, we know that the result was disastrous, and the performance just wasn't good enough. It was better than Arsenal, but that's not saying a whole lot. By the third minute, Spurs were falling into their old pattern that they fell into against Arsenal. Here we see Musa Sissoko being marked out of the game, Eric Lamela being covered by a cover shadow, and the same for Serge Aurier. This forces Davison Sanchez to choose between going backwards or going long. Of course, he chooses the long option, and Spurs lose possession. Of course, it's not all about the opposition, right? A team might be phenomenal at pressing, but it's up to our team, Spurs, to figure out a way to beat that press, right? It's up to the individual players on the pitch to figure out the key to the lock that will essentially lead to an attacking move. And unfortunately, we didn't see much of that against Dinamo Zagreb because a lot of players just move the ball very slowly. Here we see the press kind of break down for Dinamo, and the Dinamo player doesn't really know where to go. He doesn't know whether to cover Harry Winks or Musa Sissoko. Davies, unfortunately, just hangs onto the ball for too long and misses this opportunity to pass it to either of the midfielders who are coming in for a short pass in order to progress the play. Of course, Davies, without a good passing option, or so he thought, turns around and passes it backwards. As disappointing as those performances against Dinamo and Arsenal were, things started to look very, very good against Aston Villa. And part of the reason why is because Spurs found a way to not only build up from the back, but also outnumber the midfield in order to create counter-attacking opportunities while in possession. Both Lucas and Gio Lo Celso were a huge part of that. And that's why I was a bit surprised that people thought, yeah, Gio had a good game, but clearly he's still rusty. I saw a little bit of that, but I thought what he brought to the match against Aston Villa was so key for Spurs' dominance throughout the game. And it was also just very, very simple stuff. It wasn't like any through passes, although he had a couple of those, but more so just his simple movement and his eagerness to open up the space was extremely helpful as Spurs tried to play out of really tight space. Here's the most obvious reason why Spurs succeeded in building up from the back against Aston Villa. They have two forward players pressing four different outfield players, four when you count Hugo Lloris, right? So that means that the three players in yellow, Rodon, Sanchez, and Højbjerg, can create different passing angles in order to play around this press. So right off the bat, Aston Villa's first wave of pressing is just not enough. I mentioned Giovanni Lo Celso earlier, and I do think that he had a very good game because he was a great connector between Pierre Højbjerg, Tanguy Ndombele, and Tottenham's forward line. So here you see Tanguy Ndombele with two different options. He can either pass it to Højbjerg, who can then break the pass into Sergio Reguilon, and the Spaniard can attack down the left channel, or he can pass it to Gio Lo Celso and progress the play down the center right. That's exactly what he chooses to do. And here you see Gio Lo Celso looking exactly where Kane is and where he's headed. And this is another way that Aston Villa struggled with their 4-4-2 formation. 4-4-2 formation was simply too rigid for the amount of fluidity that Spurs had on match day. So here we see four different players outnumbering Aston Villa's two that are close to the ball. One of them being Gio Lo Celso. He plays the ball into the space. Kane runs onto it, and an attacking opportunity is created. Don't get me wrong, guys. Just because we're new to YouTube doesn't mean that we don't know how YouTube works. I'm sure that there's one of you out there that's thinking, man, this guy just absolutely loves Gio Lo Celso, and he thinks he's one of our best players. Well, actually, all of that might be true, but I'm not saying that that Lo Celso had a phenomenal game, that he blew Aston Villa out of the water, right? Rather, that it was giving Spurs what they lacked against Dinamo Zagreb and Arsenal, which was those short passing options and short interplays in order to progress the ball. I think that Harry Kane, Tanguy Ndombele, even Reguilon had phenomenal games. They played extremely well. Højbjerg with 6 tackles, the most tackles out of the entire match. So yes, I think there are players that shined more than Gio, but he greased the machine so well that I really needed to call this out. Here's an example of how small movements matter. Tanganga has the ball, and he is playing it towards Tanguy Ndombele, who is coming short for the pass. This drags the Aston Villa defender out of position, which means that Lo Celso can run into that space in order to, in turn, drag Target out of his position. And all of a sudden, you have a wide open right channel space for Harry Kane to run into. And that's exactly what happens. After this transition of play, Lo Celso receives the ball and he plays Harry Kane down the right-hand side, again creating another attacking opportunity for Spurs. All in all, against Aston Villa, Tottenham Hotspur showed that they can indeed build from the back, even if the opposition doesn't line up well enough to limit that. But also they showed that with Gio Lo Celso, they can play out of very tight areas and open up channels for attackers to run into. And I think with the likes of Dele Alli still being on the fringes, Bale barely getting some game time, there's been a real need for a player like Gio Lo Celso to open up that space and to be smart about his movement. Kane has obviously been superb in that role. Lucas, I even wrote an article about him and how his role has evolved under Mourinho and how he's dropping deeper in order to confuse the opposition. But now we have a real life attacking midfielder pulling off the role that has been trained to do for many years. And that's very, very exciting. I do think that Lo Celso has a big part to play in Spurs' wrap up of the season, but I'd be keen to hear what you think. Am I going blind and am I thinking that Lo Celso actually had a really good game when in reality he struggled and it just wasn't good enough? Am I making a mountain out of a molehill? Very, very keen to hear your comments and hear what you'd like to see from us next. Any recommendations are helpful. Cheers, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. Bye.